CEO goes all in on poker game with maid, and what she did at the end was shocking. Jonathan Reynolds never imagined he'd find his housekeeper rifling through his confidential documents in the private office of his Bel Air mansion. The discovery should have resulted in immediate dismissal, but his wounded pride led him to a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply firing Deborah Wilson, the CEO of New York City's largest tech company decided to humiliate her in what he considered a brilliant way. He proposed a game of poker, convinced he'd demonstrate his intellectual superiority over the woman who had dared to invade his privacy. "You want to know what's in these papers, don't you?" said Jonathan, holding the stack of documents he'd found in her hands. "Then let's make an interesting deal." Deborah remained silent, her hands firmly clasped over her impeccably pressed navy blue uniform. At 52, she had learned that hasty words cost jobs, and jobs like this one were rare for women like her. "Let's play poker," Jonathan continued, an arrogant smirk playing on his lips. "If I win, you tell me exactly what you were looking for here. If you win, which is impossible, I'll answer any question you have about the company." The proposal was absurd. Deborah knew it. But something about the dismissive expression of this 45-year-old man, with his perfectly styled hair and Italian suit, deeply irritated her. For 2 years she had cleaned this house, served his meals, washed his clothes, always treated like invisible furniture. "And if I accept?" she finally asked, her calm voice belying her inner turmoil. "Then prepare to be publicly humiliated," Jonathan replied, heading to the office bar to retrieve a deck of cards he kept in the drawer alongside Cuban cigars. "But don't worry, I won't fire you for this. Consider it a free life lesson." What Jonathan didn't know was that Deborah had grown up playing cards with her father, a man who had taught her far more than just game rules. Robert Wilson had been a founding partner of the very company that now employed his daughter as a maid, a bitter irony she had carried like a silent burden for years. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. 30 minutes later, they were seated at the mahogany desk in the office, a fresh deck being shuffled by Jonathan's confident hands. The poker chips he'd brought from an old game with business friends were evenly distributed between them. "We'll start with small bets," he said, dealing the cards with theatrical flair. "I don't want you losing your job over gambling debts." Deborah watched his every move carefully. It wasn't just the game that interested her, but the way Jonathan handled the cards, the sequence of his gestures, the small tics that revealed more about his personality than he realized. She had learned from her father that poker was far more about reading people than luck. The first hand was cautious. Jonathan bet conservatively, expecting her to make basic mistakes. To his surprise, Deborah played with a precision that intrigued him. Her decisions were calculated, her movements efficient. No wasted gestures. "Interesting," he murmured when she won the first round with a well-played pair of queens. "Where did you learn to play like that?" "My father taught me," she replied simply, stacking her winnings with meticulous care. The answer annoyed him. Jonathan had expected nervousness, maybe even tears. Instead, he found a woman who met his gaze with steady eyes and played with a confidence that defied all his expectations. The second round heightened the tension. Jonathan raised the bets, putting on the table the equivalent of a month of Deborah's salary. She didn't hesitate to accept, moving her chips with the same calm as before. When the cards were revealed, he had 2 pairs, but she had a low straight that narrowly won. "Beginner's luck," Jonathan muttered, but something in his voice betrayed the first crack in his confidence. Deborah didn't respond. Instead, she watched as he shuffled the cards for the next round. There was a pattern there, a specific sequence he unconsciously repeated. It was exactly the kind of detail her father had taught her to notice decades ago, when she still believed the world was a place where hard work and honesty were rewarded. During the third hand, she began asking seemingly innocent questions about the company. When it had been founded, who the original partners were, how he had risen to the position of CEO. Jonathan, focused on his cards and still convinced of his intellectual superiority, answered arrogantly, proud to recite his successful trajectory. "The company was founded 32 years ago," he said, arranging his cards with precise gestures. My mentor, Richard Montgomery, was a visionary. Unfortunately, he had some issues with partners who didn't share his progressive vision. The comment made Deborah grip her cards tighter, but she kept her expression neutral. Richard Montgomery had been the man who betrayed her father, using legal tricks to push him out of the company he had helped build. Hearing that name come from Jonathan's mouth as if he were a hero nearly made her lose her composure. "What kind of issues?" she asked, feigning casual curiosity while raising the bet. "Old-fashioned partners with limited business perspectives," Jonathan replied, matching the bet without realizing he was being led into dangerous emotional territory. One of them was particularly stubborn, always questioning strategic decisions. Fortunately, Richard managed to restructure the ownership and free the company from those negative influences. With every word, Deborah felt a mix of anger and sadness growing in her chest. Those old-fashioned partners included her father, Robert Wilson, an honorable man who had refused to participate in the tax evasion schemes and inflated contracts Richard had proposed in the company's early years. She won the third round with a high straight, and Jonathan began showing signs of irritation. His bets became more aggressive, his remarks sharper. The fourth and fifth rounds followed, with Deborah maintaining a steady lead that visibly unsettled the CEO. "You're cheating," he finally accused, slamming his cards down with excessive force. "There's no way a housekeeper could be this lucky." "It's not luck," Deborah replied calmly, gathering her winnings. "It's observation. You always shuffle the cards the same way, cut the deck in the same spot, and have a habit of touching your chin when you're bluffing." The revelation left Jonathan momentarily speechless. He looked at his own hands as if they had betrayed him, realizing for the first time how predictable his gestures were. The woman in front of him wasn't the ignorant servant he had imagined, and that discovery bothered him more than the lost chips. "Who are you, really?" he asked, suspicion coloring his voice. "I'm Deborah Wilson, your housekeeper for the past 2 years," as she replied, but there was something in her tone that suggested deeper layers. "Daughter of Robert Wilson, business administration graduate from Columbia University, with a master's in business management from Harvard Business School." The surname hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. Robert Wilson. He knew that name, had heard Richard mention it many times over the years, always with a mix of reluctant respect and irritation. The former partner who had caused so many problems, who had questioned so many decisions, who had finally been removed from the company under circumstances Richard had never fully explained. "You're Robert Wilson's daughter," he repeated slowly, the pieces of a puzzle starting to fall into place in his mind. "That's why you were going through the documents. That's why you took a job here as a maid." "That's why a lot of things," Deborah confirmed, her hands beginning to shuffle the cards with fluid, precise movements. "But mostly because I wanted to meet the man who inherited what my father helped build." The atmosphere in the office shifted completely. What had started as a cruel game to humiliate a maid had turned into something far more complex and dangerous. Jonathan felt like a man who had just realized he was walking on quicksand without noticing. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice losing all its earlier arrogance. "I want to play to the end," Deborah replied, dealing new cards. "And I want you to bet something that truly matters to you." Jonathan hesitated. Every instinct told him to end the game immediately, call security, and throw this woman out of his house. But his pride, wounded and challenged, spoke louder. He couldn't let a maid, no matter who her father was, humiliate him like this. "Fine," he said, straightening in his chair. "Let's bet something serious. My imported car against..." "What? You don't have anything of value?" "I have information," Deborah answered, pulling a yellow envelope from inside her uniform. "Information I've gathered working here for 2 years about tax evasion, fraudulent contracts, bribes paid to public officials. Information that could destroy your company and send you to prison." The envelope landed on the table between them like a ticking bomb. Jonathan stared at it with a mix of fear and fascination, realizing the game had become far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. "You're blackmailing me," he said, but his voice came out hoarse, without conviction. "I'm offering a fair bet," Deborah corrected. "Your car against my envelope. If you win, you take the information and can do whatever you want with me. If I win, I keep your car, and you listen to my full story." For long minutes, the only sound in the office was the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. Jonathan knew he should refuse, end this insane game, and handle the situation through lawyers and legal measures. But curiosity, mixed with an arrogance that refused to die, pushed him forward. "I accept," he said finally, picking up the cards she had dealt. The sixth round was tense from the start. Both knew the stakes had gone beyond material things, entering the territory of honor, justice, and settling scores. Deborah played with the same calm as before, but Jonathan could see a new intensity in her eyes, a determination that went beyond simple victory. When the cards were revealed, Jonathan had a full house, a nearly unbeatable hand. For a moment, his arrogant smile returned, and he reached for the envelope. But Deborah made no move to hand it over. "Interesting," she said, studying his cards. "A very good hand indeed." "The best you'll see today," Jonathan replied, stretching his hand toward the envelope. "Now give it to me and let's end this charade." "I haven't shown my cards yet," Deborah said calmly. She turned hers over one by one, building an almost unbearable tension. 10 of diamonds, Jack of diamonds, Queen of diamonds, King of diamonds. And finally, with a deliberately slow motion, the Ace of diamonds. Royal flush, the highest possible hand in poker. Jonathan froze, staring at those 5 cards as if they were a mirage. It was mathematically almost impossible. The odds of getting a royal flush were 1 in over 600,000, and she had done it exactly when it mattered most. "Impossible," he murmured, checking the cards again. "You cheated. You must have cheated." "I didn't cheat," Deborah replied, stacking all the chips in front of her. "I just watched and learned. For 2 hours you shuffled the cards the exact same way. For 2 hours you cut the deck in the same spot. And for 2 hours I memorized the order of the cards." The revelation hit Jonathan like an avalanche. She hadn't just won, she had completely dominated the game from the start. Every previous victory, every moment of tension, had all been carefully calculated to lead him to this point. "You knew," he said, his voice a mix of admiration and horror. "From the very beginning, you knew you were going to win." "I knew I could win," Deborah corrected. "My father taught me that poker is about odds, but also about understanding people. You're smart, Jonathan, but predictable, and your arrogance blinds you to your own patterns." Jonathan abruptly stood from his chair, walking to the window overlooking the immaculately kept garden of his estate. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in, and he felt like a man waking from a dream to find his life had completely changed. "What do you want from me?" he asked without turning around. "Revenge? Money? The company?" "I want you to listen to me," Deborah answered, still seated at the table. "Really listen, not as you would to a maid or a subordinate, but as you would to an equal. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot." Now continuing, Jonathan slowly returned to the table but didn't sit. He stood, hands resting on the back of the chair, like a man preparing to hear his sentence. "My father was a founding partner of this company," Deborah began, her voice taking on a narrative tone that carried decades of pain. "Not just an investor or a name on paper, but one of the men who had the original vision, who worked 18-hour days in the early years, who sacrificed everything to turn an idea into reality." She paused, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the polished table surface. "Robert Wilson was the kind of man who believed success should come with responsibility. When the company started growing, and Richard Montgomery suggested questionable practices to boost profits, my father opposed him. Not out of naivety or lack of ambition, but because he believed building something lasting required integrity." Jonathan listened in silence, but his expression revealed the discomfort of a man confronted with truths he'd rather ignore. He knew Richard Montgomery. He had been his protégé for over a decade, learning everything about business and leadership from him. The idea that his mentor might have been dishonest was deeply unsettling. "The disagreements escalated when the company began winning government contracts," Deborah continued. "Richard wanted to use political connections and bribes to secure bids. My father threatened to expose these schemes if they proceeded. That's when Richard decided he was an obstacle that needed to be removed. The unfolding story was complex and painful. Richard had used sophisticated legal maneuvers, taking advantage of loopholes in corporate contracts that Robert Wilson had signed in good faith. A series of secret meetings with other minor partners, promises of higher dividends, veiled threats about the company's stability if the internal disputes continued. In the end, my father was forced to sell his shares for far below market value, said Deborah, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. Richard claimed it was for the good of the company, that ideological differences were harming growth. The other partners, intimidated and lured by promises of quick profits, agreed to the expulsion. Jonathan finally sat down, the weight of the revelation pressing on his shoulders. He had heard Richard's version many times, always painting Robert Wilson as an impractical idealist who didn't understand the realities of the modern business world. He had never questioned that narrative, accepting it as absolute truth. My father never fully recovered, Deborah continued, her words cutting through the air like sharp blades. Not just financially, though that was devastating, but emotionally. He had dedicated the best years of his life to that company, believing he was building something important, something that would make a difference. Discovering that his partners were capable of such calculated betrayal broke something inside him. She stood and walked to the bookshelf, running her fingers over the spines of volumes Jonathan had probably never truly read, only bought to impress visitors. He tried to rebuild, to start over. But at 58, with his reputation tarnished by rumors spread by his former partners, doors closed one after another. Businessmen were afraid to associate with someone Richard Montgomery had labeled as problematic. The bitterness in Deborah's voice was palpable but controlled, as if she had learned to carry that pain without letting it consume her completely. My mother, Dorothy, had to return to work after 20 years of caring for the home and family. She got a job as a seamstress in a clothing factory, working 10-hour days to try and keep our house. I was a teenager, studying on scholarships I earned through academic merit because all our savings had been invested in the company that cast us out. Jonathan felt something stir in his chest, an uncomfortable emotion he couldn't name. Guilt, perhaps, or shame for his own complacency. He had lived comfortably on the foundations men like Robert Wilson had laid, never questioning how that foundation had been built. My father passed away 7 years ago, Deborah said, turning to face Jonathan directly. A sudden heart attack while trying to secure a loan to start a small business. Until the end, he believed he could rebuild, that he could prove his worth again. He died without ever overcoming the betrayal. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Jonathan looked at his own hands, searching for words that didn't seem to exist. How does one respond to a story like that? How do you apologize for crimes you didn't commit directly but benefited from? That's why you came to work here, he said finally. For revenge. At first, yes, Deborah admitted, surprising him with her honesty. I wanted to meet the man who had inherited the empire built on my father's ruin. I wanted to understand how you slept at night, knowing the history of the company you ran. She returned to the table but didn't sit, standing instead like a judge ready to deliver a verdict. But after 2 years of watching you, cleaning your house, preparing your meals, listening to your phone calls, I discovered something I didn't expect. What? Asked Jonathan, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. You didn't know, she said simply. Every time Richard mentioned the past, every time he spoke about the old partners, you accepted his version without question. You trusted him completely, like a son trusts his father. The observation struck Jonathan deeply. Richard had been more than a mentor to him. He had been a father figure in the business world, guiding him from his early days as an intern all the way to his rise as CEO. The idea that this admiration might have been built on lies was almost unbearable. But ignorance isn't innocence, Deborah continued, her voice hardening. During these 2 years, I've watched you continue the same practices that destroyed my father. Questionable contracts, cash payments to public officials, tax evasion disguised as tax optimization. Jonathan tried to protest, but she raised her hand to silence him. I've seen the documents you keep in the safe behind that fake Rothko painting. I've seen the spreadsheets tracking off the book's payments. I've heard the recordings you make of conversations with politicians to use as future leverage. You may not know the full history of the company, but you know your current practices perfectly well. The accusation was precise and devastating. Jonathan had grown up in business, assuming certain practices were just part of the game, necessary to compete in a hostile market. Richard had always justified these actions as business protection, a way to ensure honest businessmen weren't destroyed by corrupt bureaucracies. "What do you want from me?" he asked again. But this time his voice carried a resignation that hadn't been there before. "I want you to choose," Deborah replied, finally sitting back down. "You can keep being the man Richard taught you to be, or you can decide what kind of leader you truly want to become." She picked up the yellow envelope still lying on the table and held it between her hands. "This envelope contains enough evidence to destroy the company and send you to prison for decades. Recordings of incriminating conversations, financial documents proving tax evasion, photos of cash deliveries to public officials, all meticulously collected during 2 years of working as your maid." Jonathan stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake ready to strike. Every paper inside represented a decision he had made, a line he had crossed, a choice he had followed under Richard's teachings. "But I also want to make another offer," Deborah said, interrupting his dark thoughts. "One final bet, much bigger than anything we've played so far." "What kind of bet?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A hand of cards. Just one. If you win, I hand over all the evidence and disappear from your life forever. You'll never hear from me or the Wilson family again. You can go on living exactly as you do today." Deborah paused, letting the weight of the proposal settle in his mind. "But if I win, you do exactly as I say for the next 6 months. No questions, no resistance, no using your position or money to work around my instructions. 6 months for me to show you a different path, a way to lead that your mentor never taught you." The offer was both tempting and terrifying. On one hand, it gave him a chance to escape the consequences of his past actions entirely. On the other, it meant surrendering total control of his life to a woman who had every reason to want his destruction. "And if I refuse?" asked Jonathan. "Then by tomorrow morning, copies of all these documents will be on the desks of investigative journalists, federal prosecutors, and the IRS," Deborah answered without hesitation. "You'll have maybe 48 hours before the life you know is over, forever." Jonathan stood up again, pacing the room like a caged animal. Every option seemed to lead to a different cliff, and he couldn't see a way out that would preserve his position and dignity. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, stopping in front of Richard's portrait that dominated one wall of the office. "If you have the evidence to destroy me, why not just do it? Why give me a way out?" "Because revenge won't bring my father back," Deborah replied, her voice heavy with deep sorrow. "And because destroying you doesn't fix what's broken. But changing you, transforming this company, reshaping the way you do business, that might honor his memory." The answer surprised Jonathan. He had expected anger, a desire for payback, a thirst for violent justice. Instead, he found a woman who seemed genuinely interested in building rather than tearing down. "Besides," Deborah continued, a small smile appearing on her face, "I've learned something interesting about you these past 2 years." "What?" "Underneath all the arrogance and the bad habits Richard taught you, you have the potential to be a true leader. I've seen how you treat lower-level employees when you think no one's watching. I've seen your spontaneous generosity towards social causes. I've seen moments of doubt and questioning that prove your conscience is still alive." The unexpected praise made Jonathan deeply uncomfortable. He had spent so long seeing himself through Richard's eyes as a ruthless, pragmatic businessman that he'd nearly forgotten any other version of himself. "I accept," he said finally, returning to the table. "One final hand, but I want to shuffle the cards myself, and I want you to cut the deck." "Fair enough," Deborah agreed, watching him pull a fresh deck from the drawer. Jonathan shuffled the cards with extreme care, varying his movements, changing the patterns she had memorized. When he finished, he pushed the deck toward her to cut, eliminating any chance of manipulation. The tension in the room was almost tangible as he dealt 5 cards to each of them. Both knew this hand would decide not just the immediate future, but potentially the fate of hundreds of jobs, millions in contracts, and decades of legacy. Jonathan looked at his cards and felt his heart race. 2 aces, 2 kings, and a queen. A very strong, full house, a hand that would beat most possible combinations. For a moment, he let himself believe luck had finally turned in his favor. Deborah studied her cards without revealing any emotion. Her years playing with her father had taught her to keep a neutral face no matter how strong her hand. But inside she felt a mix of relief and apprehension. "Show," Jonathan said, confident in his victory. He turned his cards over one by one, building suspense until the full house was revealed. For a moment, he allowed himself a genuine smile for the first time in hours. "Very strong hand," Deborah said, eyeing his cards, "but not strong enough." She turned over her own cards, revealing 4 aces and a king, 4 of a kind, a hand that beat his full house by a clear and undeniable margin. Jonathan stared at her cards for long seconds, as if expecting them to magically change. The reality of what had just happened slowly sank in, along with all the implications it carried. "Impossible," he murmured. 2 exceptional hands in the same round. The odds are astronomical. "Sometimes life arranges itself in strange ways," said Deborah, gathering all the cards. "Maybe it's coincidence, maybe it's fate, or maybe it's just time for some accounts to be settled." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, feeling both defeated and strangely relieved. For years he had carried the weight of questionable decisions, justifying them as necessary for success. Now, for the first time, someone was offering a different path. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice heavy with resignation. "First, I want you to officially hire me as a management consultant," Deborah said, shifting to a more businesslike tone. "Not as a housekeeper, but as the qualified professional I am, a salary that matches my education and experience." The change in her demeanor was striking. The submissive woman who had cleaned his home was completely gone, replaced by a confident executive who knew exactly her market value. "Second, over the next 6 months, we'll implement a full compliance program together. No bribes, no tax evasion, no fraudulent contracts. The company will operate within the law no matter how much it affects short-term profits." Jonathan tried to protest, but she raised her hand to silence him. "Third, you'll create a restitution fund for employees who were harmed by the company's past practices. Unjust firings, unpaid wages, denied benefits, everything will be made right." "That will cost millions," Jonathan said, mentally calculating the financial impact. "And you have millions," Deborah replied without sympathy. "The question is whether you'd rather spend them doing what's right or lose them in fines and lawsuits when everything comes to light." The logic was undeniable, even if painful. Jonathan had built his fortune on shaky foundations, and now he was facing the true cost of his choices. "Fourth, you'll establish a scholarship program in Robert Wilson's name," Deborah continued, "for underprivileged youth interested in business and technology. A way to honor the memory of a man who believed education was the only true path to social change." The mention of her father's name brought genuine emotion to Deborah's voice for the first time since she had begun listing her conditions. Jonathan realized that beneath all her determination and control, she still carried deep grief over the loss. "And fifth," she said, reaching her final point, "you'll help me write the true story of this company's founding. Not the sanitized version Richard created, but the full story, including what happened to my father. This will be made public, so future generations of business leaders understand that success built on the destruction of others isn't true success." The 5 conditions hung in the air between them like an invisible contract. Jonathan knew each one would fundamentally change not just how his company operated, but how he saw himself as a leader and as a human being. 6 months, he finally said. "And then you decide whether you want to keep being the kind of businessman I'll teach you to be, or if you'd rather go back to your old ways," Deborah replied. "But at least you'll have had the chance to see there's another path." Dear listener, If you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. In the weeks that followed, the transformation in Jonathan's life was radical and unsettling. Deborah arrived every morning at 8 o'clock, no longer wearing a maid's uniform but dressed as the capable executive she had always been beneath the servant's facade. The first change was in the office dynamics themselves. Deborah settled into an office adjacent to Jonathan's, from where she coordinated a full audit of all the company's operations. She brought in outside consultants, legal compliance experts, and independent auditors who scrutinized every document, every contract, every transaction from the past 5 years. The process was painful and revealing. Jonathan discovered that many practices he considered industry standard were in fact blatantly illegal. Bribes disguised as consulting fees, tax evasion masked as tax planning, inflated contracts diverting public funds into private accounts. "How did Richard manage to hide all this from me?" he asked during one of these reviews, staring at a spreadsheet showing suspicious payments over several years. "He didn't hide it," Deborah replied without looking up from the documents she was examining. "You simply didn't want to see. It's easier to believe you're a successful businessman by merit alone than to accept that some of that success came from questionable methods." The answer cut deep, but Jonathan was beginning to accept that many uncomfortable truths were yet to surface. One of the most disturbing discoveries was a secret file Richard had kept on former employees and competitors. Jonathan found detailed dossiers on people who had tried to report the company's illegal practices, including personal information used for intimidation and blackmail. "My God," he murmured, flipping through photographs of employees in compromising situations, recordings of private conversations, even details about personal debts and family troubles. Richard was a criminal. "Richard was a man who believed the ends justify the means," Deborah corrected. "And you were trained to think the same way. The question now is whether you can unlearn those behaviors." The transformation process wasn't just administrative, it was deeply personal. Deborah arranged meetings with employees who had been harmed by the company's past decisions. Jonathan came face to face with people who had lost jobs for questioning dubious practices, employees who had worked years without promised benefits, and families ruined by arbitrary dismissals. One meeting was particularly impactful. Margaret Johnson, a 56-year-old accountant, had been fired 5 years earlier after uncovering discrepancies in financial reports submitted to regulators. "I tried talking to my supervisor first," Margaret explained, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "When he told me to ignore the irregularities, I went to HR. They said I was being problematic, questioning decisions above my pay grade." Jonathan listened silently as Margaret recounted how she was gradually isolated in the company, excluded from important meetings, her responsibilities reduced until she was finally let go for organizational restructuring. "After that, I couldn't get a job anywhere in the industry," Margaret continued. "Richard spread rumors that I was a disloyal employee, leaking confidential information. At 56, I had to start over in a completely different field." The story repeated itself with variations in meeting after meeting. Honest employees punished for their integrity, families destroyed by corporate retaliation, careers ruined for refusing to participate in illegal schemes. "How am I supposed to fix this?" asked Jonathan to Deborah after one of those particularly difficult sessions. "How does someone repair decades of damage?" "One step at a time," she replied, "starting by taking responsibility and working to create systems that prevent it from happening again." The creation of the reparations fund was a complex and emotional process. Deborah worked with labor rights attorneys to establish fair compensation criteria. Each case was reviewed individually, considering not just direct financial losses, but also emotional harm and career impact. For Jonathan, signing each compensation check was a painful exercise in humility. He saw the real cost of his past actions translated into concrete numbers, into human suffering that could be partially remedied with money, but never fully erased. "Margaret Johnson will receive $500,000, Deborah informed him during one of their weekly progress meetings, including lost wages, unpaid benefits, and compensation for emotional damages. 500,000, Jonathan repeated, mentally calculating the impact on the company's cash flow. And how many similar cases do we have? 37 so far, with more under investigation, Deborah answered. The estimated total is $15 million. The number was significant, but not devastating for a company of the size he led. What truly troubled him was the realization that $15 million represented only a fraction of the suffering caused by his corporate policies. Alongside reparations, Deborah implemented structural changes in how the company operated. She created anonymous reporting channels, established ethics committees with representatives from all hierarchical levels, and instituted independent quarterly audits. Transparency isn't just a nice word, she explained during a presentation to the entire board. It's a daily practice that requires constant vigilance. Every decision we make must withstand public scrutiny. Some of the older directors resisted the changes, arguing they would make the company less competitive. Jonathan found himself in the strange position of defending reforms he would have dismissed as impractical just 2 months earlier. Competitiveness based on illegal practices isn't sustainable in the long run, he said during a particularly tense meeting. It's only a matter of time before everything comes to light, and then we lose not just the ill-gotten profits, but also our reputation and freedom. Internal resistance was just one of the challenges Jonathan faced in the first months of transformation. Competitors who once saw his company as an ally in questionable practices now treated him with suspicion. Some contracts were cancelled when the company's new ethical standards clashed with traditional business methods. "We're losing clients," the sales director reported during a monthly meeting. "The state oil company cancelled the contract because we refused to pay the usual unofficial commissions." "And what was the value of that contract?" Deborah asked. $12 million annually, the director replied reluctantly. "And how much would we have spent on bribes to keep it?" "About $2 million a year." "So we're talking about $10 million in clean revenue versus $12 million in tainted revenue," Deborah concluded. "Not to mention the risk of fines, prison, and total destruction of the company if we were caught." The math of honesty wasn't always favorable in the short term, but Jonathan was learning to think in longer cycles. Sustainability, he discovered, required immediate sacrifices for lasting benefits. One of the initiatives that impressed him most was the Robert Wilson Scholarship Program. Deborah worked with local universities to identify talented students from underprivileged communities, creating a comprehensive program that included not only financial aid, but also mentorship and internship opportunities. "Why is this so important to you?" asked Jonathan as they reviewed applications for the first scholarships. "Because my father believed education was the only true form of social justice," Deborah replied, her hands tenderly tracing the photograph of a young applicant. "He said we could either complain about the world's injustices or educate the next generation to be better than us." The passion in her voice was evident, and Jonathan began to understand that the program represented far more than compensation or public relations. It was a way to honor the memory of a man whose ideals had been crushed but not forgotten. The first recipients of the program were selected in an emotional ceremony at the company's headquarters. 15 young people from underserved communities, all with academic excellence and proven potential, received full scholarships for business, engineering, and technology programs. During the ceremony, Jonathan gave a speech that would have been unthinkable months earlier. He spoke openly about the company's past mistakes, the importance of corporate social responsibility, and how businesses have a duty to help reduce social inequalities. Robert Wilson was a visionary who believed business success should go hand in hand with social commitment, he said, looking directly at Deborah. "These scholarships are our way of honoring that vision and ensuring his legacy inspires the next generation of business leaders." Deborah watched the speech with a mix of satisfaction and melancholy. Seeing her father's name publicly celebrated by someone working for the company that had betrayed him was both vindicating and healing. After the ceremony, she and Jonathan walked in silence through the company gardens, both lost in thought about how drastically their lives had changed in just a few months. "You're keeping your part of the agreement," Deborah finally said. "The transformation I see in the company, in you, is real." "Sometimes I don't recognize my own life," Jonathan admitted. 3 months ago, I would have thought all of this impossible. Now, I can't imagine going back to the old way of doing things. The confession revealed a transformation that went beyond business practices. Jonathan was redefining his own identity, questioning not just how he ran the company, but who he was as a person. The 6-month period isn't over yet, Deborah reminded him. There are still challenges ahead. She was right. The biggest test would come a few weeks later, when Richard Montgomery returned from a long international trip and discovered the changes that had taken place in his absence. The confrontation was inevitable and explosive. Richard, now 72 but still carrying the full authority of decades of leadership, called an emergency meeting with Jonathan in the office that had once been his. "What the hell is going on here?" he roared as soon as he entered the room, clutching a folder of reports on the implemented changes. "Have you completely lost your mind?" Jonathan sat behind the desk Richard had commanded for decades, but his posture was firm and resolute. Deborah was present, seated in a chair beside him, her presence a constant reminder of the reasons behind all the transformations. "I'm fixing mistakes that should have been corrected long ago," Jonathan replied calmly. "The company was operating outside the law, Richard. That's not sustainable." "Outside the law?" Richard laughed bitterly. "You think we got where we are by following every little rule? This is the real world, Jonathan, not a business ethics classroom." The discussion that followed was intense and revealing. Richard defended every questionable practice as necessary for corporate survival, arguing that competitors who didn't follow similar methods would inevitably be destroyed by those who did. "You're handing over our competitive advantage for free," he insisted. "In 2 years, this company will be bankrupt, and you'll remember this conversation." "I'd rather have a smaller, honest company than an empire built on corruption," Jonathan replied, surprising even himself with his firmness. It was then that Richard noticed Deborah for the first time since entering the room. His eyes narrowed as he recognized her, and a look of gradual understanding crossed his face. "Deborah Wilson," he said slowly. "Robert Wilson's daughter. Now it all makes sense." The tension in the room escalated dramatically. Deborah rose from her chair, staring at the man who had orchestrated her father's downfall with a calm that masked decades of pent-up anger. "Richard Montgomery," she replied firmly. "The man who taught this company that betrayal and dishonesty were business virtues." "Your father was an impractical idealist," Richard shot back, his voice dripping with contempt. "He would have ruined the company with his ridiculous scruples." "My father built this company on principles you destroyed out of greed," Deborah countered, stepping forward. "And now, I'm helping rebuild it the way he always wanted." The standoff between them was charged with history and emotion. Richard represented an old guard that saw ethics as an obstacle to success, while Deborah embodied a new generation that believed prosperity and integrity could coexist. "Jonathan, you can't let this woman destroy everything we've built," Richard said, turning to his former protege. "She's using you to get revenge for decisions made before she was even born." "The decisions were made, Richard, but the consequences are still with us," Jonathan replied. "Deborah isn't destroying anything. She's helping me build something better." Jonathan's defense even surprised Deborah. For months, she had watched his gradual transformation, but hearing him stand up for her against his former mentor showed a fundamental shift in his priorities and values. Richard tried one last strategy, threatening to use his influence with the board to reverse all the changes. But Jonathan was ready. "The board will be informed of everything, Richard," he said, opening a folder containing copies of all the incriminating documents Deborah had gathered, including evidence of every illegal practice from the last 15 years. They'll have to choose between supporting the transformation or facing the legal consequences of sticking to the old ways. The threat was clear and effective. Richard realized he had lost not just a battle, but the entire war. His former protege had become a formidable adversary, armed with evidence that could destroy not just the company, but his own reputation and freedom. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," Richard finally said, heading for the door. "And when it all falls apart, don't come asking for my help." After he left, the office remained silent for long minutes. Jonathan and Deborah exchanged glances, both realizing they had crossed a point of no return. The company's transformation was now officially complete, and there was no going back. The remaining months of the 6-month agreement were spent solidifying the changes and establishing systems to ensure they would last. Deborah worked with corporate governance experts to create structures that would prevent any return to the old ways. A significant milestone was the publication of a book about the company's true history, co-authored by Jonathan and Deborah. The book documented not only the successes, but also the ethical failures, serving as a case study on the real costs of corporate corruption. Building on solid foundations, the transformation of a company and its leaders. Jonathan read the title from the first printed copy. Sounds a bit pretentious. Sounds honest, Deborah corrected. And honesty, we've learned, is rare in the business world. The book became an unexpected success, adopted in business and ethics courses at universities across the country. More importantly, it inspired other business leaders facing similar dilemmas between profitability and integrity. As the 6-month period neared its end, Jonathan found himself in a situation he never could have imagined at the start of this journey. The company was now operating entirely legally and ethically. Employees were more motivated and productive, and profits, contrary to all pessimistic predictions, had actually increased. "How is this possible?" he asked during one of the final meetings of the agreed period. Everyone said honesty would be too costly. "Dishonesty is what's costly," Deborah replied, presenting financial reports that revealed the hidden expenses of past practices. Bribes, lawyers to cover up wrongdoing, employee turnover due to toxic environments, lost contracts when scandals surfaced. Corruption is a diminishing return investment. The math was convincing, but Jonathan knew the transformation had gone beyond purely financial matters. He had rediscovered a version of himself he never knew existed, a leader who could inspire rather than just intimidate. At the last official meeting of the 6-month period, Deborah made an unexpected proposal. "I want to keep working here," she said, "not out of obligation or agreement, but because I believe in what we're building together." "As a consultant?" Jonathan asked. "As a partner," she replied, completely surprising him. "I want to invest in the company, become an official part of it, not for revenge or reparation, but because I see the potential for something truly special." The offer was both generous and strategic. Deborah was offering not just her capital, but also her expertise and credibility to help the company grow sustainably. "Why?" Jonathan asked. "You got everything you wanted. The company changed, your father was honored, justice was served. Why tie yourself to me in this place?" "Because I've learned that real transformation isn't an event. It's an ongoing process," Deborah answered. "And because, despite everything that happened, you've become the kind of leader my father would have respected." The compliment struck Jonathan deeply. For months, he had struggled to redefine himself, questioning every decision and motive. Hearing that he had earned the respect of the daughter of the man his company had betrayed was validation he hadn't known he needed. "I accept," he finally said, "but on one condition." "What?" "When I retire, and that might be sooner than you think, you take over as CEO. This company needs leadership that truly understands the balance between success and responsibility." The proposal was the final acknowledgement of how completely their positions had reversed. The housekeeper had become the natural heir to the business empire, while the arrogant CEO had learned humility and purpose. 2 years later, the ceremony for Deborah's inauguration as the new CEO was held in the same auditorium where the first Robert Wilson scholarships had been awarded. Jonathan, now chairman of the board, delivered an emotional speech about leadership, transformation, and the power of forgiveness. Deborah Wilson didn't just save this company. He told an audience that included employees, clients, scholarship students, and members of the business press. "She saved me from becoming someone I couldn't live with being." Under Deborah's leadership, the company thrived in ways that went beyond purely financial metrics. It became a model for corporate social responsibility, a benchmark for fair labor practices, and an incubator for social innovations that benefited entire communities. The Robert Wilson Scholarship Program had expanded to include not only college students, but also vocational training programs for adults, corporate daycare centers, and community development initiatives that transformed entire neighborhoods. My father always said a company's success shouldn't just be measured by what it builds, but by what it leaves behind, Deborah said during a televised interview on the 3rd anniversary of her CEO appointment. We want to leave behind a fairer society and real opportunities for the next generation. The transformation didn't go unnoticed in the business world. Other companies began adopting similar models, creating a ripple effect of change that spread far beyond the original organization. Ironically, Richard Montgomery was also touched by these changes. Now retired and facing health issues, he made an unexpected move by seeking Deborah out for a private conversation. Their meeting took place in a quiet cafe in downtown New York City, far from the business spotlight. Richard, visibly aged and frail, struggled to find words that could express decades of accumulated regret. "I was wrong about your father," he finally said, his hands trembling slightly as he held his coffee cup. "And I was wrong about so many other things, too." Deborah listened in silence as he recounted his version of the events that had destroyed Robert Wilson. It was a story of unchecked ambition, of decisions made in the heat of the moment with lasting consequences, of a young man who mistook cruelty for leadership. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Richard continued. "I know I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know your father was a better man than I was, and the company you lead today is closer to his vision than anything I ever built." The conversation was long and painful, but also cathartic. Deborah didn't offer forgiveness, but she offered something perhaps more valuable: understanding. She realized Richard had become a prisoner of his own choices, carrying guilt that had eaten away at his soul for decades. "The past can't be changed," she said as their talk came to an end. "But maybe it can be honored by doing things differently in the present." Richard died 6 months later from natural causes worsened by decades of stress and guilt. In his will, he left one final surprise: a substantial donation to the Robert Wilson Scholarship Program, accompanied by a letter requesting the money be used to fix some of the mistakes an old fool made in his arrogance. Richard's memorial service was small and private, but Deborah made sure to attend, not out of obligation or protocol, but because she recognized that even people who make terrible mistakes are capable of growth and remorse. "Why did you go?" Jonathan asked when she returned from the funeral. "Because everyone deserves to have their humanity acknowledged," she replied. "Richard did terrible things, but in the end, he tried to do some things right. That doesn't erase the past, but it acknowledges that people are complex." Deborah's philosophy on forgiveness and growth became one of the hallmarks of her leadership. She created second-chance programs for employees who had made mistakes, mentorship systems to help young leaders avoid ethical pitfalls, and reconciliation initiatives that healed old wounds within the organization. 5 years after the famous poker game that changed everything, Jonathan and Deborah found themselves at a card table again. But this time, they weren't betting fortunes or risking careers. They were playing a friendly game in the company's recreation room, surrounded by employees participating in a charity tournament. "Can you still read my patterns?" Jonathan asked, shuffling the cards with deliberately varied movements. "I don't need to anymore," Deborah replied with a smile. "I already know the kind of person you are now." The game continued in a relaxed atmosphere, with conversations about future plans, social projects in development, and memories of the early difficult days of the company's transformation. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day," Jonathan said as he dealt new cards. "You would have kept being who you were. I would have stayed invisible, and hundreds of people would have kept suffering needlessly," Deborah answered. "Fate has strange ways of correcting imbalances." "Do you really believe in fate?" "I believe in opportunities," she said, rearranging her cards. "And I believe that when people of good faith work together, they can create something more powerful than any of them could achieve alone." The company had become exactly that, proof of what was possible when visionary leadership combined with genuine social responsibility. Profits kept growing, but sustainably and ethically. Employees were engaged and proud of their work. The surrounding community benefited from continuous investments in education and development. "Royal flush," Deborah announced, revealing her final cards with a mischievous smile. "Again?" Jonathan laughed. "You're never going to let me win, are you?" "Where's the fun in that?" she replied. "Besides, you still have a lot to learn about probability and strategy, and about leadership and responsibility and a dozen other things," Jonathan added, gathering the cards. "Luckily, I have an excellent teacher." The conversation was interrupted by one of the young scholars from the Robert Wilson Scholarship Program, who approached the table timidly. "Sorry to interrupt," said Jasmine, a 20-year-old engineering student who had grown up in an underserved neighborhood. "But I wanted to thank you both personally for everything you've done for me and my family." Deborah stood to hug the young woman, seeing in her a reflection of the opportunities her own father had dreamed of creating. "You earned everything on your own," Deborah said. "We just opened a few doors. You had to walk through them. But without those doors, I never would have had the chance," Jasmine insisted. "My mum always told me education was the only way to change our situation, but it seemed impossible until you made it possible." The young woman's genuine gratitude moved both Jonathan and Deborah deeply. It was a constant reminder of why they had chosen to transform the company in a way that went beyond profits and traditional growth. After Jasmine walked away, Jonathan and Deborah sat in contemplative silence for a few minutes, watching the activity in the recreation room. Employees at all levels interacted casually, young scholarship recipients chatted with senior executives, and there was a positive energy that starkly contrasted with the tense, hierarchical atmosphere of previous years. "My father would be proud," Deborah finally said. "I think he'd be proud of you, not necessarily me," Jonathan replied. "I'm still the man who benefited from the company that hurt him." "But you're also the man who chose to change when given the chance," Deborah reminded him. "And that perhaps is more important than the mistakes of the past." End of story. Now, what did you think of this journey of transformation and forgiveness? Do you believe Deborah made the right choice by offering a chance for change instead of simply seeking revenge? Share your thoughts in the comments about this story of how life's game sometimes deals us unexpected cards. Your likes and subscriptions go a long way in helping our channel continue to bring you heartfelt stories like this one.